It is the year 2355, and Captain Jean Luc Picard, one of Starfleet's most promising officers, now faces court-martial for the loss of his ship, the USS Stargazer. However, this case was suddenly and unexpectedly curtailed by the presiding judges. Why did this happen? And what were the Admiralty so afraid of? Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media, and today I'm going to be talking about something that I read in the biography of Captain Jean Luc Picard. That is to say, this is of course a beta canon source, however I would consider it a quite reliable one. Gets most of the details right, has some interesting ideas. Most critically, this biography was written prior to Picard Season 2, and so rather than having his relationship with his mother being, "My mother used to look up at the stars," instead they go for a more grounded and frankly more gut-wrenching story about how his mother suffered from Irumodic syndrome, and while he was away gallivanting around the galaxy, her health continued to deteriorate until he came home and she barely recognized him, lost all of her recent memory and didn't even know that he was in Starfleet or was a captain. A very tragic story, but one that is certainly, I think, quite pertinent, particularly for those who have had relatives suffer from dementia and other such conditions. So suffice it to say, I think it's a better story of Picard's life than we got in later seasons of Picard. In any case, the book goes into a great level of detail regarding the court-martial faced by Picard after the loss of the Stargazer. This is something that actually was echoed all the way back in TNG's Measure of a Man, with Philippa being the, JAG officer? Local JAG officer? No, she was more like a district attorney sort of thing. There were some allusions there to the Stargazer Trial and her conduct there, which we will be getting into. And critically, the Stargazer Trial is actually a seminal moment, a critical moment in the history of the service, and could have potentially been one of Starfleet's greatest scandals and embarrassments. Let me just open with this thought. Attribute nothing to malice that you cannot attribute to stupidity. With that out of the way, let's talk about the Stargazer Trial. So, let us talk, first and foremost, about the prosecuting JAG, that being Commander Philippa Lavoie. Now, she was actually an old flame of Picard from the Academy days. Isn't this always the case? Same thing with Kirk, it's weird that. Anyway, she charged him with culpable negligence and dereliction of duty. She attempted, in making her prosecution, to prove that the Stargazer was undermaintained and unfit for service, and that this was Captain Picard's fault. So her argument really proceeds thusly. The average starship of the time had a lifespan of about 16.2 years. I'm going to press X to doubt this, because this is really still Lost Era, Golden Age Starfleet. At this point, this is 2355, so the Galaxy-class ships and its cousins would have only just been entering service, very, very barely. The majority of ships would have been Ambassador-era, Highlighter ships, and of course all the 23rd century legacy ships. The average age for a starship would probably be significantly older. So you'd probably be looking with an average starship age of 16.2 years. That would mean that half of Starfleet would have been built pre-2339 and then the other half built post-39. Put that aside, the USS Stargazer fell well outside of that margin, being 63.7 years old, which implies that it was launched back in 2292. And she argues that Picard was clearly aware of this. This is why Picard actually went to great lengths to maintain the Stargazer, in fact devising an even more rigorous maintenance schedule than was regulated. However, she argued that Picard should have recommended to the Admiralty that his ship be decommissioned, and the fact that he didn't was testament to the fact that Picard's desire to command outweighed the safety of his crew. At that point, the case was dismissed as This threatened to set an unrealistic and unprecedented standard. So Philippa was then reprimanded for being too aggressive and apparently then quit her job on the spot. And this is how Starfleet avoided the Stargazer Scandal. The Stargazer Scandal is, well, exactly what it sounds like. It is frankly scandalous that the Stargazer was still in service and was allowed to continue in such a dilapidated state, and required of its commander such excessive and rigorous maintenance as to be well beyond even what was expected of any starship commander. But really what we have to ask is, well, how did we get here? How did we get to the best and brightest of Starfleet, their most respected officers, resorting to covering their own arses? Why were ships like the Miranda class and the Oberth class still in service? How did this happen? What were the deficiencies in Starfleet's procurement and force design philosophies? In order to answer this question, we have to go back to the inception of Starfleet and its fundamental philosophy when it came to procurement and force design. That is basically the philosophy of Starfleet was to produce starships until they stopped coming back, or until they couldn't afford to make any more. What this meant was that things that worked would be ideas that worked would be iterated upon, and ideas that didn't work died. Now, this is not a linear process, not in the least. There was obviously huge amounts of debate over direction and what it was exactly that worked in each particular starship design. The tree of evolution of starship designs isn't exactly linear. There's often a lot of cross-pollination and sharing of ideas, but it is certainly to say that the fundamental philosophy being that if ships kept coming home, you knew to keep making them and to iterate on those concepts. If the starships you launched didn't come back, you knew that that was probably an idea no longer worth pursuing. And this is why throughout the early period of Starfleet, you see ship designs that are actually very similar to one another, but they're just iterating on them with newer components and technology, but they aren't actually changing out whole shapes. For example, the use of mononacelle designs basically don't change for centuries. The mononacelle is just a proven design, and that's why it keeps recurring. So while this might appear something of a simplistic and reductive philosophy, it's fair to say that it kinda worked, and took Starfleet from having a relatively mediocre fleet to having one of the most advanced and powerful fleets of the entire Alpha Quadrant. And this is ultimately what made the Federation so strong and enabled its borders to continue expanding with the confidence that Starfleet was able to keep abreast of the latest technological developments while also maintaining a force of decent size. You had to maintain this balance between being advanced enough to maintain parity with the other local powers, particularly the ones who are more technological in orientation, but also being able to produce ships in enough numbers so as to be able to protect their increasingly larger and larger borders. Now this works up until you get to the golden age of Starfleet, because unfortunately what happens after the Khitomer Accords and the Treaty of Algeron is that they stop having frequent hostile encounters with hostile species, and ships start coming back. And they keep coming back. And so it becomes impossible to understand whether or not a design is actually any good, or it just isn't facing anything dangerous. So ships keep surviving, so you don't have to replace them, and at the same time you aren't facing a major external threat, which means there's no incentive to innovate, which means the old ships are still in service, and there's no incentive to replace them. Which means that you just end up with either completely new designs because niches aren't opening up. So for example, look at the Cheyenne class. The Cheyenne class is a very, very good ship, I'm not going to deny it, but it does have a bit of a blind spot in as much as it's designed not to do the job of the Constellation, because the Constellation was still in service. Because the Constellation, largely, apart from the Stargazer, which was the real wake-up call, after the Stargazer Trial, Starfleet Command and the Admiralty do actually take a lot of those criticisms on board and put Captain Picard behind a desk for a while in terms of getting the fleet up to strength. I should have mentioned that earlier. But yes, they put a lot of emphasis on fleet modernization. But it's fair to say that up until that point, Constellation was still doing its job, so a true replacement was never devised. The Cheyenne class is not a replacement for the Constellation. It doesn't do anything that the Constellation does. The Constellation is a big utility carrier. The Cheyenne is a fast light cruiser. They're not the same thing, not even remotely. They're both very good ships, but it just so happens that one is an awful lot more modern than the other and still doesn't satisfy that niche. Similarly, the Ambassador class doesn't replace Excelsior. Excelsior, of course, won't really be replaced by anything satisfactorily. The Narendra probably would have been the best option to replace Excelsior, but they didn't have the ability to build those ships in numbers because so much construction infrastructure by that point had already been spoken for, and so that results in a limited production run, and so they only end up replacing Excelsior with the Excelsior 3 way off in the 2390s. And so you can now see the problem. Because ships kept coming back, Starfleet wasn't getting active feedback on what was and wasn't working, what were and weren't fit designs for purpose. And this means that they persist with a lot of designs when they really shouldn't, because they don't know any better. And it also means that there isn't actually anything there to take the place, which of course just doubles down on the incentive to keep these ships running, right? Because there isn't a satisfactory replacement for the Constellation class, because there isn't a need for, that then actually puts even more emphasis, even more importance in maintaining those ships, because if you don't, then you lose a critical capability. So what actually ends up happening is that you have this hodgepodge Starfleet of the Golden Age, where you have these hyper-advanced ships, these, mid-tier ships, and then these very, very old 23rd century carryovers. And unfortunately, there's deficiencies, because if you actually lose those, you can't afford to lose these old ships. You want to get rid of them, but getting rid of them will almost certainly result in a capability gap. So you then can't, because your force design philosophy has all the while you've been busy inventing new concepts and new ideas for starship design, and certainly that space afforded to Starfleet to create things like the Ambassador and the Cheyenne was well utilized, and those are excellent ships that really move the ball forward. But equally, it means that there's an awful lot of neglect on the basics, and that the basics are sort of left behind to these ships that are really no longer fit to carry on their services. And so this was the scandal that Philippa could have blown wide open. This was what Starfleet Command was worried about, because they realized they had become complacent with the fact that they had very good captains who wanted to stay in command of their ships, who would, do everything possible to keep their ships running, and that they would probably get away with it because their ships weren't going to face active hostile threats, and so they could afford to sort of just cruise it along and keep coming out with these flashy new things and explore these exciting new concepts without catering for the very basics. So, just to wrap all of this up, with the Stargazer scandal, the problem wasn't arse-covering admirals, or even a peaceful Federation. In many ways, this just goes to show how victorious the Federation was in the early half of the 24th century, how high they were riding off of their successes of the 23rd century, where ruthless and efficient and sober force design had ensured their security and ultimately allowed them to come out on top of all the major conflicts of that period. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the very modes of thinking that allowed that to happen. These modes of thinking that were then handed down. The outset of Starfleet's creation is that the Federation and its ideals are confronted with a cruel and hostile universe that will seek to crush them at any cost. And this is why Starfleet's force design had to be so draconian in many ways, so ruthless and cold and calculating, was because they knew that they faced a hostile universe. The people back in the founding of the Federation who devised these philosophies, they had no conception that the Federation would one day become the dominant superpower of the Alpha Quadrant. That idea never crossed their mind. As far as they were concerned, the Federation was a little defensive alliance that they conceived primarily as a means of self-defense and economic security, but it certainly wasn't anticipated that it would bloom into this enormous thing that would actually come to dominate most of local space. And so it is really quite difficult to improve when you're the one at the top. And sometimes the only way is down, and then to react, adapt, and change your thinking. And that is ultimately what we see happening throughout Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, is that ongoing changing process, that change in philosophy of starship design. But that is all something that started off right here with the Stargazer Scandal. So thank you all for watching, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members, my Navarks, Jeffrey Ballard, Tully DT, Rella, and Macross Schaffer. My commanders, Philip Tye, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narata, Nathaniel Mead, Gabe Logan, DM Tribal Typhoon, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Rizel 3D, James C, Alcara Dreamer, Joe G, Turd Ferguson, and You Don't Know Trek. And I salute my Centurions, Pendleberry, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, Squadra Course, John Nicole, Athys Collection, Greg Martin, Shermos, Marzarine, and Bird of Play D3. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.